Welcome, everybody, to the Seen and Heard podcast, a conversational series. I have the pleasure today of being joined by Simon Partridge. Apart from a short time in the about-to-be-abolished Greater London Council developing community radio, has been an itinerant writer and researcher. He's inspired by the primate attachment imperative of Dr. John Bowlby's environment of evolutionary adaptiveness. He has covered community media, devolved politics, the British-Irish conflict and resolution, ethno-cultural mingling across the islands of Britain and Ireland, the psycho-neurobiological consequences of detached British upper-class child rearing and boarding schools, war trauma, and more latterly, complex PTSD, adverse childhood experiences, and continuous stress trauma in high conflict zones. He continues to explore and write, partly from lived experience, about the linkage between class positionality, early attachment deficits, and ACEs. He was also a founding director of the London ACEs Hub, CIC. Welcome, Simon.
Thank you, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here, and I think you created a great platform here.
Oh, thank you very much, Simon. Yeah, so I usually start just by sort of letting people know how we connected, but it was about a year and a half ago, just under when Seen and Heard was first getting started. I asked Piers Cross, as one of my first ever conversations, who should I speak to if I'm going to start Seen and Heard? The two names he gave me were you and Nick Duffel. So we've been in contact ever since, and I've always appreciated your guidance and your knowledge on the subject. So thank you.
Yeah, I think you've set in motion a great initiative, which I've tried to support as much as I can, really.
Yeah, thank you, Simon. Part of our ongoing conversation, sadly, recently has been around the sad passing of Joy Schaverien. So I know that's you attended the funeral, and we both had great admiration for her work. So how's that been for you with the sad news of Joy's
Yes, I mean,
passing?
I think it's timely just to acknowledge that, Chris, and pay a tribute. And personally, Joy was actually the first person who got me thinking in a sort of more reflective way about my experience of boarding school and my rather unusual upper class background. And this was back in about 2005. So, initially I had quite a lot of contact with her, and she was very helpful, put me in touch with Nick Duffel, and I went to one of his workshops, and to some extent, as they say, the rest is history.
Yeah.
So I'm very grateful. And it's sad to see she's gone, but I think it's in some ways your generation which has got to pick up the thread now.
Yeah,
I'm
thank
also
you,
getting
Simon.
quite old. 78. There we go.
Well, thank you for your words. Yeah, I think for so many, I said in my tribute that I wrote for Joy that if she was the mother, Nick was the father of the sort of movement of exploring this topic and making it okay to speak about it. And obviously for many people who were separated from parents because of institutional upbringing, having them as a real sort of compassionate sort of figureheads for this work. I've always found really personally supportive, and when I try and explain things, I always use Joy's ABCD: abandonment, bereavement, captivity, dissociation, because it's just so easy for them people to understand.
Yeah.
I see what happens. Yeah,
it's a good summary. Yeah.
It's very good. Well, thank you for mentioning her. And so, for our time together today, with all my guests, I'd love to understand a little bit more about where people came from and how their early years were for them. So, could you tell me a little bit about how things were for you growing up?
Yes. It's strange, isn't it, really, sort of going back over one's early life, reviewing it really through a sort of much more informed lens now than one had at the time. So I think one should bear in mind there are possibly some discrepancies which creep in. I think I grew up in a slightly unusual background, Chris, because I was from the age of three, four, brought up on a small farm in the East Sussex countryside. I don't come from a sort of urban middle class background, which I think most people who go to boarding school probably do. Not all, obviously, but so that kind of coloured a lot of my early experience. I think there was a move at the age of, we moved to the farm about when I was about 4. And I think it's interesting because it's only when one sort of has to, like, what was I thinking about before we actually sort of started the recording or the preparation. And I was thinking, actually, I haven't really given much thought to what the early move was like, but it must have been a big rupture, you know. So that was there. Look, growing up in the countryside was, I'm still basically the boy from the farm in lots of ways, and I'm still camping in North London, although I've been here for four or five decades now. So in lots of ways, it was quite idyllic, to be surrounded by farm animals, the greenery, the woods. I could sort of escape to and build dams and things. And then, rather sadly, it was interrupted by the sort of expectations of my parents' backgrounds, that I had to go away to school. So I was sent off to kindergarten, which was a day school, which was okay. Then we went to me and my sister went to a sort of pre-prep school, where we both ended up being weekly boarders. Now, goodness knows what was going through my mother's mind. My father didn't go to a boarding prep school. He went to a day school in Worthing. But my mother's parents were actually French, or her father came from a French Indian colonial background. And I think she'd been sent off to boarding school at 6, because her parents were in India for most of the year. Now, my benign sort of view of this is that she was breaking us in gently to be sent to full boarding school at 7 or 8. But I never had a chance. I never talked to her about that because I wasn't really aware enough to do so. So off to boarding school at. I was still actually. I wasn't. I thought the first article I wrote, it says sort of crossing the threshold at 8 or goes, but actually I was still 7. It turns out. But in a horrific way, Chris, I think I may have asked to go early. I may have jumped before I was pushed, because that was part of the cultural background. And I think that, and I could almost see my dad's farm over the next hill. I mean, it was kind of a very strange experience in a way. One of the bits that sticks in my mind is an early pandemic called the Asian flu came along in 1957, and the whole school closed for a few weeks. And I went home to the farm, and I helped my dad take the milk churns in those days up the hill, and that really sticks in my mind as a kind of shared experience with my father. I think I was look. It was part of the expectations of my social background, so it didn't seem totally bizarre. But in retrospect, there was just a kind of, and it wasn't the most awful of boarding schools either, compared with some of the horror stories one hears about. Except I was abused by the school doctor during an annual examination, but I didn't really get to grips with that until I went to Nick's workshop, 50 years later. And one of the fellow people there had been to a Catholic boarding school, and I think I talked about it in a slightly jocular way, and he said, "Hang on a moment, Simon. I think something pretty serious happened here." So that was, a kind of very nasty, brief experience, but has had lifelong repercussions. And I remember I think one of the worst things about prep school was being ill. And I did some damage to my nose on a toboggan, which was never properly looked at, and I've still got a deviated septum. And I just think, that's terrible, really. To be left in a school and not be grossly abused, but just neglected, really, and not looked after. Um, so that's something I've thought about more recently, but obviously at the time I wasn't really aware of it. So I get through prep school, and I have evidence that I went back afterwards. So I can't subjectively say I kind of recorded it as a dreadful experience, at the time. That's quite difficult to sort of process in a way. How one's later knowledge then kind of comes back to affect one's earlier experience. So I actually took the 11 plus and passed it. I could have gone to grammar school in Lewes, a town not far from where Dad's farm was. But I knew nothing about grammar school. My parents didn't know anything about that sort of state education. So in a way, I just trundled down the expected upper class path, to my dad's old school, a fairly familiar pattern, which I don't think is talked about enough actually, because quite often the sons go to the schools of their fathers, which has its own implications. You're following in your father's footsteps, can you live up to the expectations? Is it, and it's changed quite a lot since he was there anyway. And I sort of drifted through 4 years of public boarding school, Eastbourne College. I can't say anything absolutely terrible happened to me, but I think I was kind of very adrift in lots of ways. I didn't know who I was. I didn't know. My father came and he'd been captain of the first 15. He was a great games player. And I remember latterly he used to come and down on Saturdays and watch the games played on the big playing field in front of the main building. And I would sneak a meeting with him for half an hour, 20 minutes, But that's as far as it went, really. He didn't really have anything else to do with the school. And I sort of, I think I lost my way, basically, and dropped and left early and went off to try and follow my father's footsteps as an agricultural student. Beginning of several failures. Is that good enough as a sort of
Yeah,
background?
yeah. Thank you so much, Simon, for sharing that. And yeah, heartbreaking to hear about the abuse at your early school, your pre-prep and your prep school. Yeah, very very sad to hear that. And unfortunately, in the work that we do at Seen and Heard, sort of the rates of people who suffered something, along those lines are very, very high indeed. Certainly between 30 and 40% from the work that we do, and it's very, very high. And
Yeah,
but my heart is with you. That's thank you for sharing that, and also that just the context of how the familial system, the sort of societal familial structure works, whether it's going to same school as your father, the expectations were that that kids go to boarding school, and that your mother felt in some way perhaps that she was sort of easing you in gently by having that experience.
yeah. I think we need to get to a point where we're talking about boarding school syndromes in the plural rather than just one simple model, because I don't think it fits all.
No, I agree, and I think we'll sort of get into that as the podcast
Yeah,
expands, particularly around. I was having a conversation with Penny Kavanagh about her research and book,
yeah,
and I know that she and that piece of work looked at the wider familial structures, and posing perhaps that whilst there is absolutely boarding school syndrome, there is also perhaps sort of boarding school family syndrome around the
yeah,
kind of familial stuff. So
And
we'll get into that.
there's the whole third culture stuff as well, which has come in recently.
Yeah, absolutely. But for you, just sort of continuing your journey then, so you're feeling quite adrift, as you mentioned, some sort of full starts a bit getting into your father's work, so the agricultural side of things. How did after school? How did things shape for you in adulthood? What were you carrying out of those formative years, and how did that
Yeah,
form what came
yeah.
next for you?
I think it might be worth mentioning, Chris, that this was the sort of mid 1960s when there was the culture of flower power coming over the hill. It was a radical point in its own way, and the Beatles and the Rolling Stones were coming along. There was flower power and long hair, and in a way that was, in a way, it helped me, excuse me, to subvert some of the familial norms, but it was also quite heady stuff. So I went off to. We haven't quite got to 1968, which, as you probably know, was the scene of much disturbance across Europe, particularly in France. So I went off. I spent a year working on a farm as a practical year before going to agricultural college, and which was actually quite an interesting experience. I can milk a cow and drive a tractor. Um, but then I went off to agricultural college, and I just felt completely adrift. I mean, the people there were the people I least identified with at public school, and I think it was an upheaval I couldn't really cope with, Chris. I would say I was almost on the verge of a breakdown, and I left. I sort of One of my patterns is to run away when the going gets tough, and I left after a term. I think much to my parents' disappointment, but to give them due, they didn't go bananas about it, And then actually, this is coming back to me. I then went off to a crammer in Brighton, so that was one of my kind of connections to Brighton. Took some more A levels, and I was always very contested between, the sort of practical science side of my dad, who'd become a Royal Marine straight from boarding school, and there was a kind of much more sort of arty side in my family through my mother's side and my uncle, who used to paint, So I was kind of sort of torn really between the sort of something more artistic and arty and something. I tried the sort of science stuff at school. That didn't work. So I took these A levels. I was doing French and English. I got a surprisingly good pass in English, and a bare pass in French, which was partly relating to my own sort of familial background on my mother's side. And I was offered a place at Liverpool University. And about this time, I inherited some money from my grandmother, who died, and I never made it to Liverpool. Now that's a kind of I'm not quite sure why, but I dropped out. I dropped out to North Wales, where my sister had gone to university, and I'd helped to get into university. I mean, I took her there. My parents didn't. And it was almost as if vicariously through my sister, I was sort of trying to get myself some sort of education, but failed. So you could live very cheaply in North Wales at that time, and there was a sort of arty community there, which I sort of joined up with. I sort of lived on the edge of the university. I was a sort of dropout, really. Um, but in a sort of, and I did one or two quite creative things. I helped a friend at university put on a drama production. Design the set. Um, uh, in a way, kind of. I mean, goodness knows what qualifications I had to do it, but it turned out quite well. So this is the itinerant bit of me, if you like.
Mm,
I'm quite good at picking up things and doing things. Not very good at staying in a kind of formal setting, with
mm,
structure.
mm,
So uh, that lasted for about 5 years. I think the money was running out. The girlfriend I had at the time went off to complete her social work course in London, and it all sort of really fell apart, Chris. And I think a bit of me wanted to follow her back to London and see whether we could repair the relationship, and it didn't work. But I did get myself onto a course at the Polytechnic of Central London. Now I think the University of Westminster, to do a sort of media studies course,
mm,
where I lasted for a year. Again, I couldn't really sort of handle the formality and the structure.
mm, mm,
So, but I learned a bit about how to put a sentence together. The punchy opening paragraph, etc. So I suppose that fed into my later writing.
mm. Yeah, thank you, Simon. Yeah, thanks for sharing that part of the journey. And for you, then reflecting back, you mentioned you've been on one of Nick Duffel's boarding school survivors retreats, workshops, weekends that he runs, and you sort of come to awareness of this later. Looking back now, as you can, through the lens of your work attachment ACEs, your own personal sort of journey, what did you leave? What did you leave your formative years with, as far as um, you some of the difficult stuff, some of the gold, if you like, some of the good stuff. What were
Yeah.
your ways of operating and coping in the world?
Well, I think my kind of roots in the countryside have always been very important, Chris. If there's a touch point, if the going gets really rough, I'll try and walk in a green space.
Mm,
And I've got a small garden in North London, but the garden's very important to me. I can't imagine living in a flat without a garden. So I think that's been a kind of lifeline in some ways. Um, I suppose my capacity to improvise and put things together, um, and I, yeah, I think a sort of a bit of sort. I mean, I think the rebel in me has been unproductive in some ways, but kept me going in others. And uh, I have a kind of think a natural curiosity, partly about trying to work out where the hell I've come from and who I am. But also I think about the world in general. I mean, I'm constantly reminded of the intricacy and sophistication of the natural world, and
mm,
I'm sort of awed by the sort of complexity within which we live. But as a species, don't seem to negotiate very well, or not now anyway. So
mm,
there's a kind of trying to work out who I am, try to find some solid grounding, and also to understand some of the wider world and the social systems within which we all live, and of which, as we both know, the boarding school is a central institution for some, formative,
mm.
deformative.
Yeah, thank you, Simon. Yeah, and I think that brings us quite nicely through to, understanding a little bit more about how you were drawn to start writing academically about boarding school, ACEs and attachment. What was the, finding? You mentioned in the early on finding Joy's work right at the start, so 20 years ago now,
Yeah.
2005, attending Nick's very early workshops. It would have been, when he was getting going. So, what led you to those places and explorations?
Um, you know what? I'd always been writing in a slightly reflective way about what I was doing. I mean, even when I was in Wales, I wrote an article for a rather obscure Welsh magazine, which had the great title of Planet. about community theatre in North Wales. So there's always been that bit of me. And I remember my grandmother had a large mechanical typewriter, which I took to London at some point. Now I don't quite know where that came from. So, but there's always been a bit of me which has been for a long time anyway, long before I started writing about my sort of more boarding experience. All those little um, kind of episodes you described in the bio, they've all generated works, some written work. Some of it journalistic, some of it academic. Although I always find that a bit difficult to swallow since I don't have any formal academic qualifications at a degree level, and I've got one or two certificates in childcare. So in a way, it was a sort of natural development of what I'd been doing, but the subject matter had changed, if you like. And what actually is the catalyst for writing about how I started was slightly accidental, in that I went to Nick's workshop, and I may have written a kind of an account for myself about it, or something about it. We may have even been encouraged to do that, I think. And then I it was about this time I discovered Bowlby via Sue Gerhardt. I don't know if you know her book Love Matters, but it was very, very crucial for me at that point. And I got in touch with the Bowlby Centre in London, which, unlike I haven't really touched on my kind of long experience of orthodox psychoanalysis, but you could not imagine an analysand, a patient of a psychoanalyst, being invited to a meeting of psychoanalysts. That would have been a complete boundary violation. So I got in touch with the Bowlby Centre, and I thought, well, I don't know, they seem to be very different in terms of their openness. And I sort of rather tentatively said, could I come to your next conference? And they said, yeah, of course, we'd love to have you there. We like the voices of people who are, on the other side of the couch, so to speak. So I went along, joined a kind of breakout workshop. And I was quite fired up by then, Chris, about, the trauma of boarding schools, which nobody seems to be taking any notice of. And certainly most of the psychotherapeutic profession wasn't. So I suppose this is the rebel bit. I shot my mouth off a bit in the workshop, and a guy called Paul Wren, who was running it, sort of turned to me and said, "I think what you're saying, Simon, is very interesting. Would you like to write something about it for our new journal?" So, hats off to the Bowlby Centre, Chris, because really I think they've been very important to me in terms of providing a sort of safe umbrella, providing me with a platform to express my ideas. And I actually helped organise a big conference around the 25th anniversary of John Bowlby's death.
Mm.
And I got to know his son Richard a bit. I mean, and he lives actually just down the road on the Hampstead Heath extension.
Mm.
So I ended up in a rather kind of therapy part of North London. I think that's another of those sort of strange factors, which affect one's life. I mean,
It's true. Yeah, thank you, Simon. Just for those who may not be, may not know a lot about John Bowlby or he was the sort of father, if you like, of attachment theory. Just a couple of minutes, sort of top line, just to introduce people, and then they can go off and do their own exploring. What's your
yeah.
take on Bowlby and attachment?
Well, just to start with, Bowlby came from an upper class Edwardian background, so I was able to identify with that sort of quite easily in a way. I mean, that was another kind of happy coincidence, if you like. And it was quite clear to me, even though I didn't necessarily know a great deal about attachment theory, that separation was the key thing he looked at to start with, because he he was critical of orthodox psychoanalysis because it was basically a question of constructing people retrospectively through the case studies and their experience in the therapy room. Bowlby said, yeah, that's fine, but you're actually only looking at a certain group of people who can afford to come through your front door. And his early experience was partly working in a school for maladjusted. It was actually a therapeutic boarding school for kids who were having a lot of problems. And he picked up quite early on that there was something about maternal deprivation which seemed to be a key component in their problems. And he wanted to look at this from a kind of more objective scientific way. In fact, he took Freud's notion of the science of psychoanalysis much more seriously than Freud did, and developed research techniques for doing this. So basically, his three great works are all come under the title of Attachment and Loss, which I think rings a bell with almost anybody who's been to boarding school. And he was the only senior psychoanalyst, psychiatrist, psychotherapist who came out strongly against early boarding. So he ticked a lot of boxes for me, and it was just coincidence that he also lived very close to Hampstead Heath. I never met him, Chris. I mean, this is one of my great regrets. I discovered him after he'd died, but I have met people who met him. I've met him myself.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I
So
think
I think it from a certain perspective it fits very very well, and then I think actually he is intellectually a tour de force, and so and I think possibly my bias is as a kind of writer, slightly on the outside looking in. I think it suits a sort of the intellectualizing part of me, really. I think if you want broad theory, he's the guy I'd recommend. If you want more granular stuff, there are other people like Winnicott and the sort of stuff Joy does, in terms of brilliant case study analysis.
Yeah, I think I came to his work very very late, also via Annie Power, who we both know, who speaks very eloquently on the subject of upper class and attachment, and comes from a boarding school upper class background, and
she's very rare, Chris. She's very rare. She wrote, in actual fact, the first kind of commentary on my first article.
Oh, really?
And then she wrote a commentary on another article, and I was always I always thought, and you're being I don't think you quite get me. And then actually, until quite recently, I thought I went back and reread her commentaries and thought, actually, you were right and I was wrong.
Yeah,
so I rate her very highly, Chris. I think
I agree.
But there are almost no psychotherapists from an upper class background. Charles Rycroft is one of Bowlby, Charles Rycroft, Winnicott to a lesser extent, and Annie Power, who I think we both heard her say she was sent off at 6.
Yeah. So
absolutely. She's one of the few people writing out of that experience.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, she certainly sort of opened my eyes to it, particularly around, for me, the understanding that when I went to boarding school at 7, my attachment style was already avoidant from my first 7 years. So for me, it was out of the frying pan into the fire with boarding school. The school environment effectively doubled down on my avoidance, my sort of dissociation, and cue everything else that happened in my life. But I hadn't actually put that piece together until seeing her work, Bowlby's work, about what had happened 0 to 7 for me to detach that maternal, the mother wound, the sort of maternal attachment stuff. So I found it very helpful to me.
No, she's. I think she's very good, and that that intergenerational aspect for some people. I mean, in your case, I think it was a bit different, but because one can pick up avoidant attachment styles from a number of contexts. But if you come from a boarding school family, you can be sure, and this is what Penny Kavanagh, I think, doesn't quite pin down, but what she's describing is there is the boarding school family, you know.
Yeah, the boarding school family. Yeah, thank you. So, as you started to unpack this more, you're sort of you're taking on all this work from Bowlby, Nick,
Yeah.
Joy that you've talked about. What did you learn most? What did you really sort of distill out of that you brought across into your written pieces around boarding school syndrome, ACEs, and attachment?
Um, well, I think one of the things is you've just mentioned, Chris, and that is that a lot happens between 0 and 6 or 7 or 8. You know, you're not going to boarding school as a sort of tabula rasa, really. And so that was one of the things I took away. And I think, to be honest with you, I've been grappling with that for about 19 years, taking from 2005. I mean, I think until the last couple of years, and I wanted to say something like, you know, there's something more complex going on here, which involves the preschool stuff. Not for everybody necessarily, but for a lot of people who come from that sort of cultural background. Um, and I started writing about complex trauma and boarding schools way back in 2011, when I did actually write a piece about Charles Rycroft, because he was the upper class psychoanalyst who exhibited some of the boarding school syndrome traits, you know, but didn't have the brilliant man, but didn't have the vocabulary at that point to put it in that sort of context. So yeah, I think that, and I think you know, maybe you could agree that the field is broadening out, and I think it's the ambition of Seen and Heard really to you know, you realise it hooks into other situations. So I think I've been trying to sort of find a language which would introduce some complexity into the situation. And what I did, which I think now is a bit off the mark, was to say that there was a sort of a more complex type of boarding school syndrome which affected people who came from an upper class cultural background, rather than people who were first timers coming from either, you know, because they were third culture kids, or their parents worked overseas, or you had a very successful aspirational father, which may have been a bit your case, I don't know, and thought boarding school was just the thing, which I think happened to one of your directors as well. So it was an attempt to sort of, and I think I felt it. Although initially I got an awful lot of help from Joy, I think actually at a certain point I felt it's not quite getting my experience, you know. So I think quite a lot of what I've been doing is trying to broaden the field a bit, to say there is something more complicated going on, which has to take account of the cultural background as well as the institution. But what makes it difficult is the cultural background is so embedded with the institution. So, you know, which is chicken and which is egg. You know, it's actually very difficult to describe. And I think maybe I'm getting close to finding a language which does it. But so that's been one of my ambitions, if you like. And the ACEs movement really, I think, attracted me because it took the whole. In fact, Bowlby was the first person to use the term adverse childhood experiences, which I discovered one rainy afternoon by accident, reading through one of his old papers. It just seemed, and in, you know, by Suzanne Zedek, I think, I don't know whether you've had Suzanne on yet, but she's this brilliant developmental psychologist based in Dundee, um, and picked it up and organised this fantastic conference in Glasgow in 2018. And it just seemed to me to have caught the essence of attachment, but in a very accessible, popular form, Chris. And that's another bit of me. I mean, I want to get these ideas out there, as I think you do. In a way which is accessible to people. And so I was happy to jump on the ACEs bandwagon, quite frankly, and try and link it, which I did. I wrote an editorial for the Attachment Journal called Attachment Theory Extended. And I was encouraged by the then, look, I owe an awful lot to the Bowlby Centre and the Attachment Journal, because the then editor actually encouraged me to do this. She was also keen to. And I think this is actually one of the great strengths of the Bowlby Centre, is they want to make psychotherapeutic techniques accessible.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you for sharing that. And for you, for people's understanding around adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, this was an interesting one that came up in a conversation with Suzanne Zedek I had a while ago. Sort of childhood institutionalization, or boarding school, or going ending up in the foster caring system, or in group homes, state group homes. It's not specifically an adverse childhood experience as recognised within the group, is it?
Well, I look. I think if you're sent to a foster home, you should be sent there because the home circumstances are so awful and destructive. There's no alternative. Now, I think there's plenty of evidence that that's not always the case, and it could have been handled better. But I wouldn't say that in itself. It could in actual fact be a lot less adverse than the familial home. Now, I think when we get to the institution of boarding, it becomes very different, because in a way, parents are electing to make orphans of their children when they don't have to. And that, to my mind, is an ace. But I think we have to understand it in terms of a culture which has, in actual fact, lost its capacity or knowledge of what real parenting is. And I don't particularly like this term Nick Duffel's used about compliers, because I think we have to see the culture itself as being damaged. And in actual fact, inadvertently, often they would say my parents would have said, for the best of intentions, Simon, we were trying to give you the best education we could. The tragedy is, it was almost the inverse of that. What one needed was to be in a warm, secure, familial environment with a local school. I would argue, in actual fact, that elective boarding is intrinsically an ace, or several aces actually. And I think I always feel Nick and Joy sort of fudged that one a bit.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, for making that clear. I think that was the conversation I had with Suzanne, was exactly that. I couldn't, looking at the list of aces, and I kind of, when I started to do, after my breakdown, four and a bit years ago, I started to look at how many of them I had when I found out that they existed.
Yeah.
And I was sort of ticking them off as I went through.
Yes.
I thought, that there is that one missing, which was, after all of those aces, I then ended up in a boarding school.
Sorry, carry on.
No, I just felt that the institutional upbringing I then had was doubling down on the shifting sand of my foundations, if you like. So that my house of cards was built on a wobbly foundation, but the institution sort of wasn't. For many who actually, as talking about Andy Power earlier, you mentioned this, when people go to boarding school with a secure attachment, they, I had no long letters home that I hated it, that I wanted to be removed. I'd already shut down by the time I got there. For those that had a good attachment, and that ruptures at the boarding point of going to boarding school, that must be absolutely enormous for them.
Well, I think it is, and I think the paradox is, Chris, that in a way, your kind of early disruption may have in some ways saved you from some of the shock of the disruption at boarding school. But just to go back slightly, I think we have to remember that the ACE questions, which I think are very useful because they get away from this kind of rigid diagnostic labeling, and I think are much more accessible to ordinary people. But they came out of Los Angeles, and an American context where boarding school just wasn't on the horizon. I
Mm.
mean, the irony is, if you'd gone to the Bowlby origins of ACEs, you would have immediately found him, saying, "I wouldn't send a 7-year-old dog to boarding school." So he was very well aware of the connection. So I think we have to kind of put that limitation in, and I think in the British context we should certainly add. And there are things about institutions that need spelling out slightly more. I mean,
Mm.
Judith Herman also talks about institutions, but doesn't necessarily name boarding. But I think we should just stop being equivocal about this, Chris. Boarding schools are intrinsically harmful in their elective form. Period. One possible exception, again going back to the care home, if your own family context is so absolutely awful, you have a drunken or violent father or what have you, a mother who's gone off the rails, then possibly the lesser of the evils is a private boarding school. But that's not a good reason for setting up private boarding schools.
Mm.
It's a
Mm.
small saving grace, in my view.
Thank you, Simon. Yeah, that's really, really clear what you said there. And actually, when I speak to particularly people in the industry, boarding school industry, it's often cited that, but what about those young people who
Yeah,
come from these backgrounds? And as a person who came from that background, I can see both sides of the story. But as you say, that elective, whether it be aspirational, whether it be generational,
yeah,
um, uh, that's what I'm hearing really clearly from you
yeah.
is a wound in itself.
I don't think there's any getting away from that, Chris. And I think we have to give some thought to how do we try and convince people in that cultural setting that, sorry guys, with the best of intentions, you're getting it wrong. It's the
Mm.
road to hell is
Mm.
being paved with the good intentions, and I think that's a really difficult one. But I think I think they're people who are. It's a very misguided culture, and there is now a kind of term called collective trauma, which I think we've got to explore much more in terms
Mm.
of that class group. Myself,
Thank you, Simon. Yeah, I mean, as a my belief system and the work, the stuff that I read into now, that societal cultural trauma, often called. There's a great book called The Fall, which talks about our um, mass agricultural city-state culture, the last 6,000 years being a progressive fall away from our sort of hunter-gatherer community roots,
yeah,
and
yeah.
ultimately with the Industrial Revolution, the boarding school system, and everything in the UK, there has been a gradual sort of detachment from our what we're genetically and sort
Yeah,
of evolutionarily prepared for, and we now find ourselves in quite scary sort of territory. So there is a lot of work and thinking now that there is a move back, a shaping back that I certainly feel like I'm part of and want to be part of.
well, we're
Um,
we're we're on the same page there, Chris.
yeah, thank you. So, one of the things we touched on was what are these sort of big topics and debates that need to be happening around boarding and residential schools, because it's not, you are very good at talking about, the millions that go to residential schools in China or the history of them in other cultures around the world. So, what are these big topics that we haven't touched on so far?
Well, I think I was reading a bit about your background to seen and heard, and you said we have to start with the goal we have close to our experience,
Mm.
um, and I think that's always wise. The trouble is one can get trapped in that sort of rather experiential thing. And I think that we've both been involved in Pippa Palmer's attempts to broaden out the research base, and there was Dr. Ladeli from Southern Africa, and I've been very impressed. This will probably come up back to front because things do on the
No, that's
screens,
okay. Thanks. Yeah,
but
trauma proof.
Benjamin Perk's trauma proof is really very encouraging. I mean, he's a top notch guy at UNICEF, and he's that. I've just finished reading the book. I mean, it's I think a sequel to Judith Herman's Trauma and Recovery. This is my signed copy, by the way. It's one of my precious possessions. She came to a Bowlby conference and I got her to sign it. So I almost think that Benjamin Perks is trauma recovery 2.0, you know, and he's definitely kind of broadening things out as is Warren Larkin. And I know almost nothing about boarding in China, but I'm just struck by this figure, Chris. You know, there are 30 million kids in rural boarding schools in China. These aren't the kind of franchised Brit versions in the big cities. This was an effort to, quite possibly a mistaken effort, to provide education in rural China. Now, I have heard one or two horror stories indirectly, but nobody is looking at that, and just the sheer numbers dwarf anything that we're looking at. I mean, as I pointed out, you know, the number of people in kind of private boarding schools in the UK is minimal. It's less than 1%. And if you take away the overseas people, it's probably less than 0.5%. You know, but so there are a lot of people in boarding schools around the world, not posh boarding schools, um, in China, in Southern Africa. And I think it would be incredible if we could get to encourage a kind of a critical debate, which is at an international level and at a more local level. And I think we really need to actually sort of find the language which says, you know, this may be the least worst option in certain areas, but we've got to be very aware of the dangers involved. One of which we know is that the chances of abuse in an institution are incredibly high, you know, with the best of intentions. So we really need to broaden out the debate, and I'm very pleased to see that you are going down that road, you know, and I think it's your generation that's going to pick up the baton. You know, I'm part of. I mean, Joy's mortality reminds me of my own. You know, Nick isn't much younger than I am. We're going to either pass on or become kind of bystanders, a bit as like Thirstein has already. I quite respect his kind of retirement, you know. So yeah, I think this is it's a really important issue, and we know that the other side of it is, to go back to our more local situation, that so many of our leaders have been through this system and are damaged. You know, they're not people who are going to be able to negotiate this complicated world we now live in, which needs actually a much more maternal touch. If we're going to, you know, survive the complexities of the natural world we inhabit, that world needs dealing with tenderly. You know, we
Mm.
can't blunder about in it anymore as we did with the Industrial Revolution.
Thank you, Simon. They're really powerful words there. You know, as the solution to societal climate challenge, if you like, is that more connected, you know, the inner feminine, maternal um, way of looking at things, more integrated communication and relationships based. And I think something we're advocating with schools is introduction of emotion coaching, is more collaborative well-being and welfare processes within schools and things, looking to the future, that young people need EQ more than IQ going forward if we're going to turn things around. And with AI coming through as well, which if used right, does a lot of left brain heavy lifting,
Yeah,
leaving
yeah.
us a lot of right brain, a lot of space suddenly
It could
to
give us a lot more space, Chris. You're right. Yeah, yeah,
to think about how we might solve some of these crises we've got.
yeah. I mean, if we're going to take trauma informed seriously, then we can't avoid being more emotionally intelligent. And actually, this has got to be part of this should be part of the school curriculum. I
Mm,
mean, teachers uh, on from parents are the most important formative people we meet or don't meet. I mean, Benjamin Perks has got a lot of his own personal experience in the book, and he's quite clear. It was one or two teachers that saved him. Um, he came from a very very rough background. So yeah, we've got to get this embedded in our society as a kind of common sense, but we also know that it runs against a lot of the kind of norms we still inhabit.
mm,
So it's not going to be an easy struggle, I think. But
no.
I've just noticed recently the for instance, there was a little program yesterday on BBC Radio after the World this weekend about people referral units, and I thought it was an intelligent program which was just using trauma informed as if it was part of the vocabulary. I thought, hey, that's great, because okay, it can be misused to some extent, but the idea is actually starting to get around and to circulate.
Mm,
And at a certain point, it will reach critical mass, and people will say, like Warren Larkin was saying the other day, yeah, we've got to go upstream if we're going to get to grips with this. Really, yeah, it's great. We're now more aware, but what's causing it further upstream? And that's where we come back to boarding schools, because it's causing a lot of it.
yeah, thank you, Simon. Yeah, here one of the really interesting conversations I had recently was with the UK's largest provider of kind of in-school well-being programs, and speaking to one of their senior people there, I mentioned the boarding and independent school system, and she said, "Well, we've had very little to do with the system. We mainly work in the States." I said, "Was that out of choice?" And she said, "No, absolutely not. It's what tends to happen is a school will have what they would perceive behavioural problems." Kids
Yeah,
not turning up, kids turning up with black eyes, tables being thrown, classes disrupted, etc. She said, when we speak to the boarding and independent school system, they said, well, we don't have any of that. We don't need you. But her view on it was that the entire school is in basically a freeze response rather than a fight or flight response. So the kids aren't running away from the schools and they're not beating lumps out of each other or attacking teachers. There's
yeah,
just a very sinister freeze sort of
yeah,
environment that's going on. But because it's quite quiet and acceptable and within norms, if you like, for the
yeah,
school environment, and it's normalized, she said that we're not being asked in because they don't think there's a problem. But as we know, that dissociation, that freeze response,
yeah, yeah.
the minds aren't learning, they're not as expansive as they could be, and emotionally things are shutting down that then may never open up again until some
Yes.
serious work is done.
It's how do you encourage people like that, Chris, to sort of start taking the lid off a bit? Because I think they are very. I think a bit of them knows, semi-consciously, that not all is well, and it's better to keep the lid on than look underneath and try and do something about it. And I think that's a difficult one. I think you've got to kind of coach people out quite quite carefully.
Mm, I think so.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I just, for instance, I don't think there's any future for primary boarding. I mean, I just think that has to go, quite frankly. Uh, Now, that's not a message you can take to people in a kind of gentle way, except saying, well, maybe you should turn yourself into a good local school, or merge with your state primary school down the road. I mean,
Mm,
uh, change is quite difficult and painful in certain circumstances, and I think you can only sugarcoat it up to a certain point.
mm,
So that's uh, that's a difficult one.
mm. Yeah.
But maybe that's in a way, almost, if the ideas get around enough, people themselves will start saying, "Hang on a moment, I'm not sure this is the best way to go about things."
Mm.
But
Yeah,
I
thank
think
you,
we need to
Simon.
give some more thought to the actual process of change, really.
Yeah, I hear you. I hear you on that one. You touched on something earlier. I just wanted, before we sort of time starts to run out for us on the
Yeah,
conversation, is um, you touched on wounded leaders. Coming through the system, the elite boarding school system, and creating wounded leaders. Um, we you mentioned in some of your writings sort of the insidious damage boarding does to an elite class. So, what's your um, investigating that and pulling that apart and talking about that? What does that look like for you?
um, in shorthand, it looks like Boris Johnson. I think it's so difficult, I think, when we have a culture which not only normalizes, but in some ways idealizes. I mean, I've been thinking about really recently as a hero figure for a large sector of American society. Now, and I can understand that to the extent that in America there's a lot of emphasis on the entrepreneur as the hero. Um, but I think in the end it comes back to a sort of uh, a set of values, Chris, which extend beyond the material and the purely financial, and power, which I think takes us back to the more maternal again, which Bowlby, from an evolutionary point of view, thought was absolutely fundamental to our species, that we cannot actually survive without it. And we wouldn't be here if it hadn't been for that. Um, and it's and I think we can see there's a certain notion of love which is actually embedded in everything which is good, and I include nature. We only have to think of the spring image of the lambs frolicking around with the mother sheep, and how that brings joy to every heart that sees it. I've been watching Spring Watch. I don't know if you watch that program on telly, because it's a lot of it is about that at this time of year. Nature rearing its young in a kind of, and birds are just incredible in some of their courtship rituals, the way they go about it, the way they look after it. It's there in front of our eyes in lots of ways, and the trouble is, I think we're still living in the shadow of colonialism and the Industrial Revolution, which achieved certain things. One can't sort of dismiss it out of hand, but I think in the end, one's actually appealing to a different set of values. And I mean, for instance, I think our politics is corrupted because it can only think in terms of power and putting one over on the other side. I mean, I've been quite involved in this debate about VAT on private schools on Twitter. And what I've been trying, and which immediately kind of, you know, goes in different binary directions, people shouting at each other, some saying state schools are fantastic, and in actual fact, um, it's so easy to get into those sort of binary divisions without opening up a space, and in which people can actually have a discussion and reflect a bit on where they're coming from, which is why the last bit I've had published in the Attachment Journal is an effort to bring together reflective positionality and the anthropological concept, with John Bowlby's insights, because we need to open up a space, and it's what Winnicott called the transitional space, the very early things which go on between the mum and the newborn, where they're exploring each other, where they're exploring through play things that go on in the world out there for the first time, having come out of the womb. And I think that I'm talking off the top of my head now, but I think in a way one of our challenges is to create these transitional spaces where, without prejudice, we both sort of go into an area and say, well, I'm coming at it from here, you're coming at it from there. What are our real positions? Is there more in common than we think there is? And I think, for instance, in the world of education, everybody wants the best for their kids. Well, what is the optimal situation for learning in? I mean, play actually would have to come high up the list, rather than just sort of IQ quotients and performance standards.
Yeah, hey, Simon, thank you. Yeah, so as we start to bring things to a close, I know something that I was really interested in was you sent me the diagram of how you kind of see the space set out, and the words enculturation and acculturation. And I think I need to understand those a little bit more for myself, and also for people listening out there. What when you use those terms, what do they mean, and what do they relate to?
Well, in the diagram which you're going to put up, there were sort of three bubbles in a way, Chris, or four. There was a big bubble which I called the upper class culture, elite culture. Within that, there were two subsidiary bubbles. One was the family, and the other was the boarding school, and they overlapped, and in a way they merge. So if you come from within the big bubble, and all education does this, it is a process of enculturation. And if you're within the big bubble, it's a relatively, in quotes, painless process, because it's part of the expectations of your culture. Excuse me. And it's expected, and it has certain kind of outcomes and expectations, and you probably end up in quite a good place in the social system you occupy. If you come from outside that big bubble, in actual fact, it's much harder to get in, partly because most people can't afford it. But if by chance you do get in, you get a scholarship, or the firm pays for you, or you have a dad who's made a pile of money, then in actual fact you're going to find a really kind of big transition from what you've been used to and this elite culture. And that kind of abrupt transition, and you can imagine it, if you like, in terms of First Nations being removed from their tribal culture to a residential school where they were stripped of their clothes, their customs, their hair was cut off. I mean, a terrible, terrible cultural genocide, really, shock. That is acculturation. Now, it can be more or less extreme, but it's a much harder process than the enculturation process. And in a way, we should say, education education should be a gentle process of acceptable enculturation. We all have to learn and grow up and leave the family at some point, but we don't want to do it through some kind of really brutal process.
Thank you so much for talking into that. Yeah, I can understand that much better. When you mention the First Nations, obviously there is some recognition of what happened in places like Canada around the residential schools there, but probably not enough people talking about the cultural genocide that occurred and how the schools were used to administer that. It's heartbreaking, and I think that you talked briefly earlier as well about the export of our elite boarding schools into other parts of the world. With limited potential now in the UK market. If you look at it from a market perspective, the costs, VAT, the numbers are falling, the boarding numbers are falling again.
Yeah.
2025 shows, and junior boarding is down to a few thousand really now, of which more than 60% are flexi boarding. A tiny portion are weekly boarding, and then there are a few full boarders, which are largely overseas, military and mercantile and third culture kids. So, there is a real shift. So I think, a lot of these schools are now exporting and that model.
Yeah. Yeah. Look, I think it's probably change driven by economic forces and also some quite significant cultural change. I mean, I think there are more people, even in elite classes, saying, "Look, in actual fact, I don't want my kid going away under the age of 13, 14." So I think it's and I think the danger is, Chris, that it gets exported to markets which are not so aware of the pitfalls, which I think is another reason for sort of getting on a more international perspective on this, because we don't really want this reproduced elsewhere.
No, and we know that happens in all other markets. I mean, my background was business, but if you've got a product that, for instance, gets banned in the EU, evil global megacorp have been known for decades and
Yeah,
decades to just take that to a third world
yeah,
market and make
yeah,
it massive,
yeah,
because there aren't the governmental, legislative, cultural understandings of the damage it caused,
yeah.
for instance.
Well,
Um,
you put your finger on, you know from experience that so we really need to kind of find allies in these other countries, who are trying to encourage a more humane form of schooling and education. I mean, that's what we're on about, basically.
yeah, yeah. I hear you. Thank you, Simon. So as, our time together comes to an end a bit. There's so much I'd love to talk more about. But were there any final thoughts? Anything that you wanted to share that you didn't feel we got to, just to leave people with, or some final reflections?
Well, I want to sort of make a bit of an apology in some ways, because I think I rubbed some people up the wrong way by using some evidence from the Boarding School Survivors Facebook page. And I think I probably did overstep the mark. But I tried to do it in as an ethical way as I could. I put a draft of the acculturation paper up on the site, but not in the main part. It was in a kind of place where you could post media, and I invited people to comment. They didn't have to. And I got about 60 very useful comments. And I did it partly, Chris, because I couldn't think of any other way of testing out the idea. I'm an itinerant writer researcher. I don't have a kind of university at my back. So possibly I was in a grey area, and I think I've used that evidence in a way which could have been more tactfully used. Although I've been absolutely confidential about the only quote I used from it. I checked it out with the person concerned. But I do think I overstepped the mark a bit. But I hope people can understand I did it, because I couldn't see any other way to do it. I would love there to be some more quantitative research, but how we organise that, I don't know. I think it's going to be very difficult to find a sample of boarders and ex-boarders and ask them the right sort of questions and the right sort of numbers. So
Thank you.
maybe always the research is going to be a bit compromised.
Yeah.
So
Well,
sorry if I've offended some people, but it was I felt the best I could do at the time.
yeah. Well, thank you, Simon, for being honest and being vulnerable around that as well. That models it for others. Um, and you mentioned research. We'll pop some stuff in the show notes. There are a number of research projects going on at the moment around
Yeah,
boarding schools, and I think that shows there are at least three, and there's a fourth coming. So it shows that this is being talked about more. And I just want to thank you
Yeah.
personally for your work in this area. Yours, Nick's, Joy's, Piers Cross, Alex Renton, all people who've been at talking about this for a long time, have helped me personally and others come through into this and frame their experience, understand things a bit better about themselves, and ultimately to integrate and come to terms with it. So I want to
Yeah.
thank you for that,
Well,
Simon.
thank you, Kristen. You have a sort of bit of ongoing research on your platform,
Mm-hmm.
but again, this is entirely voluntary. But I think it would be very helpful if people could say what their own background is, because quite often they focus on the experience, and there's very little kind of sociological knowledge about where people come from. So,
No, thank
um,
you. Fair challenge.
um,
Yeah.
yeah, so that might be completely voluntary, but might be useful, I think.
Beautiful. Well,
Yeah,
let's finish there, Simon, as we've run out of
yeah,
time for today. But for me, for everyone, thank you for your time
yeah,
and your work in this area.
yeah,
So all of Simon's articles are on the Seen and Heard website in the Learning and Resources Library that relate to this topic. And we'll put some more information in the show notes around the diagram that Simon referenced and his ongoing work as well. So big thank you, Simon, for your time today. And a thank you to everyone at home for listening or watching. It's been the Seen and Heard podcast. I've
yeah.
been with Simon
And
Partridge.
thank you, Chris. Actually, it's interesting. In the course of conversation, one gets stimulated to think things or express things one hasn't quite thought before. So you made me actually sort of formulate one or two things today which I haven't got my head around before. So thank you.
Cool. No worries at all. Well, let's say goodbye to everyone. And thank you, Simon, and goodbye. And we'll see you all on the next episode of the Seen and Heard podcast. Thank you very much, everyone.
Bye.